Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and greetings. My name is David Livingston. I'm a Deputy Director in the Global Energy Center of the Atlantic Council, where I lead our work on climate and advanced energy. We are pleased to be holding this event today in cooperation with the Embassy of Denmark and K&L Gates, and are very grateful to K&L Gates for lending to us today this beautiful venue for our discussion. I'm also grateful for the efforts of Dan Cooksey of the Atlantic Council, who was instrumental in organizing today's event. As we work to broaden and deepen the Atlantic Council's work on the new energy economy, it is more important than ever to have a robust dialogue on the energy transition, not only among different countries, but also among different groups with different sectoral expertise and ideological backgrounds. The fact that today's stage is shared by the Danish Energy Ministry, K&L Gates, the Atlantic Council, the Heritage Foundation, and Green Tech Media is no accident. The conversation on the future of our energy sector affects us all, and a shared interest in seeing a more modern, secure, and sustainable energy grid knows no party or national boundaries. It is in this spirit that we will welcome a wide-ranging and thought-provoking discussion on the future of clean energy, using as a catalyst the remarkable strides that renewables, including offshore wind, have made in Denmark, while still providing for a secure and reliable power grid. We are particularly pleased and honored to welcome Morten Bæk, Permanent Secretary of the Danish Energy Ministry, the Danish Ministry of Energy, Utilities, and Climate, to set the scene for us in this regard. Guiding us through today's discussion, and hopefully adding in plenty of her own wisdom along the way, will be Julia Piper, Senior Editor at Green Tech Media. For those of you familiar with her podcast, Political Climate, you know that she is one of the most insightful curators in the fascinating space where politics and the energy transition intersect. That Julia is able to do this from Los Angeles, where she's based, which can often seem to be a universe away from Washington, D.C. here politically, is all the more impressive. Season 2 of Political Climate is right about to launch, so I'd encourage all of you, if you're not already listeners, to become listeners after you leave this event here today. And so, Julia, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Washington today, and also to welcome you up to the podium to take over today's discussion. Thank you. Check your mic. Should be a little green.
How about now? Is this any better? Okay, great. Thanks for bearing with me. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for having me here. I used to live in DC, and it is awesome to be back, and I love this city a lot. So a little quick background on Green Tech Media, in case you're not aware. We are a research and news and events company. We were actually acquired a couple years ago by Wood Mackenzie, which is a global research and consultancy firm. And that actual acquisition is a testament to what we're speaking to today about the maturation and evolution of the renewable energy industry. Green Tech Media used to focus on solar, grid edge technologies, and energy storage as sort of their own little ecosystems. As part of our acquisition, we are now looking on the research team at how those different technologies fit into the power market systems, fit into the bigger picture, how they compete head-to-head with natural gas and coal and nuclear. And so even our own little story, I think, speaks to this broader trend of what we're discussing today. So, and as a reminder, I am on the news team, and I urge you all to check out greentechmedia.com for all the latest headlines covering the energy transition. So a common question in the renewable energy industry was, when will renewables be competitive with other existing traditional sources of energy? And the answer is now. It's already happening, and it's happening increasingly in unsubsidized ways in competitive markets. One example of that that's relevant to our guests here today was in a German offshore wind auction last year that saw Ørsted, the Danish energy giant, previously known as Dong Energy, pitch to build one of the first subsidy-free projects. And that would just rely on power market prices alone. So that's just one little example in this broader shift of where we're headed. Another way to look at this, in 2016, the World Economic Forum pointed out that unsubsidized new renewable power was cheaper than fossil fuels in over 30 countries. By 2025, that's expected to be the case in almost every country around the world. So renewables are becoming the default for new capacity, but along with that comes a lot of issues and questions that we're going to discuss here today. How should power markets be set up? What other kinds of regulations need to be introduced to facilitate this? Other technologies need to be introduced so that we can manage these intermittent and flexible resources. What does that look like? What is their business model? The business model question brings up questions of financing and access to affordable capital and things like that. So we will get into a lot of those in today's discussion. To kick us off, I'd like to have Morten, the Permanent Secretary of the Danish Ministry of Energy, Utilities and Climate, give us a little introduction from the Danish perspective of how your country is approaching the renewable energy sector. Denmark already has a high penetration of renewables. How has the market framework evolved as the industry has evolved from your view?
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. You want me to sit here? Happy to do that. I want to start out by saying that we have been labeled a socialist country here in America. So just to be clear, I take my stance somewhere else. I think what we've done, at least in the energy sector for the past 4 decades, is transform Danish energy from a completely coal and fossil-based economy to an economy that's now largely renewables-based. We don't have hydropower to put in the mix. We loan some from Norway from time to time in an integrated market with 13 other countries. We have a market mechanism called Nord Pool, where we basically share our resources completely on market terms. We have, of course, picked winners economically in the past. We have subsidized renewables. We've subsidized wind heavily because of the wind resources that we can harvest in Denmark, and we are harvesting. And we have, if we were to be a socialist country, at least provided a model that should be scary in this country. And I say that with a lot of love and care for the American society. I lived here for 3 years in DC. I have family in Massachusetts. I think there are extreme opportunities to cooperate on this agenda. I'm happy to dive more into the details of what that entails, but I would say that we have moved certainly from also in energy, and probably more than parts of this country, a planned logic of energy build-out, of energy regulation, to a market logic, where it's basically the market that carries the transformation forward. So that comes with a different market model for pricing flexibility, for building out grid lines, for building out capacity that has taken a big stride in the past 5 years and will over the next 5 years carry us to 100% renewables in our grid, 95% renewables in our heating system, and then we're left with the transportation sector and industry, and of course agriculture, but then we'll have dealt with the climate problem. Thanks, Julia.
Great. We'll have dealt with the climate problem.
We will.
That's amazing. We're looking to you for tips. David, can you flesh this out a little bit more, what we're talking about today? We talk about price declines. What are the trends that we're seeing? Help set us up for the rest of the discussion.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of experts in this room. There are a lot of familiar faces. For many of you, this will be familiar, but I think it's important to kind of set this global context of just remembering where these technologies have come over the last 10 years. And that understanding helps you then understand why we're grappling with with markets that were not designed to deal with the technologies that we have today, and certainly not designed to deal with the rapid cost declines that we've seen over the past several years. Solar is perhaps the poster child of the successful cost decline curve in renewable energy technologies. Solar's seen a decline over the past decade of almost 80% in terms of the levelized cost of energy for solar. And if you look at a study done by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, which looked at 1,500 different commercial solar projects and kind of decomposed all the different parts of that project, from the financing to different technology components to the value chains, and looked at what is the most likely business as usual cost decline trajectory over the next 10 years, they're predicting another 60% cost decline from even where we are today. This is at a time when we're already seeing solar projects generate at 3 cents per kilowatt hour $30 per megawatt hour. Extremely attractive, and indeed new solar is, at least on paper, undercutting the economics of running even existing coal plants in many parts of the United States today. In offshore wind, we've seen similar, though slightly lesser declines, 50% since 2010 in terms of levelized cost declines in the price of onshore wind. Offshore wind, just in the past year alone, we've seen offshore wind prices decline by nearly 25%, which is remarkable. Goldman Sachs is now forecasting that we're going to see the levelized cost of offshore wind decline by another 80% by 2030, so over the next decade. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance has the global benchmark for this technology at $100 per megawatt hour, down from only 220 megawatts dollars per megawatt hour just 5 years ago. The other key story here that I think is worth noting is battery storage, right? So the commodity energy storage technology that we have today, lithium-ion batteries, we've seen a decline of 35% since only the first half of 2018. Lithium-ion batteries are now around $190 per megawatt hour or less in terms of their costs, which has come down from $800 per megawatt hour since 2012. These are remarkable declines in cost. So they look ready to sustain themselves. The challenge that we have to deal with, and I think this will be something that that Nick and Will and Morton will all be willing to dive into, is how do we ensure that even as costs decline for renewable energy, the value of that renewable energy to the grid sustains itself over time, so that we see value to the grid even as we get into higher rates of renewables penetration. And then how do we need to evolve our market structures to make sure that we're delivering benefits to consumers, to ratepayers, that we're still delivering on these sustainability targets, the likes of which Denmark has been so aggressive and ambitious on, and that we do this all in a way which is more of a symphony and less of a cacophony of new energy resources on the grid.
Fantastic, great, thanks so much for that. And another data point on the energy storage piece, increasingly we're seeing batteries coupled with renewables, often solar, competing head-to-head with gas-powered peaker plants in the US. And gas is incredibly cheap right now, so that says something to the evolution of the technology, that you have renewables and storage competing head-to-head with fossil fuels today. Nicholas, let's go to you. You're research manager for the Energy and Environment Program at the Heritage Foundation. When we spoke earlier, you laid out 3 trends that I'd love for you to go over, and we'll go into more detail later, expounding upon the conservative perspective on the state of renewables and markets today.
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Our focus is generally that we are energy, fuel source, and technology neutral. We want to see competitive markets work. And so when thinking about renewable power and the future of renewables and renewable subsidies, we want to make sure that we're talking about getting rid of all energy subsidies, not just the ones for renewables. So yes, we're not big fans of the wind production tax credit or the solar ITC, but we're also not fans of loan guarantees for nuclear power plants. We're not fans of socializing the risk of offshore drilling through the oil spill liability trust fund. There's all sorts of policies that distort markets and pick winners and losers. So if we're talking about getting rid of renewable energy subsidies, we need to be having this discussion about all forms of energy sources and technologies, which is difficult to do. But at the same time, if you actually want the consumers to be first and price signals to win the day, then you need to get rid of all of those market distortions. So that's really the first lens through which we look to how to advance the future of renewable sources. The second lens is through this consumer-centric choice angle that we like as conservatives and free marketeers, is how can we reduce barriers to entry if consumers prefer to have renewables? How can we get something like a Texas model where there is competition and choice on the wholesale side, and there's competition and choice on the retail side, so that if consumers are demanding 100% renewables or companies want to procure 100% renewables, they have the channels to do so. And I think Texas is a wonderful example of that, where you're seeing different innovations and maturations of the marketplace that are meeting that consumer demand. And so when you have those competitive markets that respond to consumers, rather than just a monopolistic market that responds to regulations and that passes costs on to ratepayers, whether it's through increased regulations or whether it's through increased costs of expensive power plants that wouldn't stand the test of time in a competitive marketplace. That's not consumer-centric. And thirdly, we look at what is the role of the federal government in advancing renewable sources. And we take a little bit of a different approach, I think, than some of my friends on the left would take, is that we don't see a role for the federal government to reduce the cost of renewable technologies, whether it's through advanced subsidies or even some of the things that the Department of Energy is doing at places like NREL. But we do see a role for the federal government if there is a national objective, for instance, advancing national security, where renewables can benefit. And we've seen that time and time again, is that renewables offer unique geopolitical advantages both in the United States and abroad. And so our focus is how can we take that basic R&D that's happening at our labs for national defense purposes, for national security purposes, and commercialize that and have the spin-off technologies like we've had with things like GPS and the internet. I think there's a lot of promise there, and there's a lot of great work that our labs are doing, and we do see a lot of commercial benefits from that work. We want to see even more. And so I think there's a lot of promise there for renewable energy technologies, for battery technologies, whatever the case may be. We want to see the proper channels and pathways that allows that basic research to get to the marketplace.
Fantastic. Great. Will, let's go to you to look at the U.S. specifically. Federal tax credits have played an enormous role in advancing the renewable energy market here. They are now starting to phase out the ITC, investment tax credit, and the production tax credit for solar and wind. What are you seeing and hearing from the industry now as they think about this transition? Can these resources survive in an unsubsidized world in the U.S.? What are some of the other changes that have to take place to accommodate this shift?
Sure. And thank you for that. And just on behalf of K&L Gates, I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming here and being here for this great opportunity. Where we see, for the reasons that I think have been set up here, we definitely see, even without the subsidies, there's an opportunity for renewable growth here in the United States. I think David said, over 80% declines in solar costs, and in wind is over 50% declines. And those prices coming down are making it more competitive so they can survive even without sort of the subsidies that have helped them maybe get there in the first place. When you add in energy storage to that, and I think Julia made a great point, storage is a game changer in a lot of different ways, but particularly for the renewable industry. One of the big knocks on renewables so far, particularly in the US markets, and being able to participate in some of the products that the US markets offer, is the fact that they're intermittent. So it makes it more difficult to predict when they're going to be there and be able to kind of capture revenue streams, which in some ways make you guarantee that you're going to be there when you say you're going to be there. And when you put a battery there, it makes it dispatchable. And as Julia said, you've got dispatchable storage, you got dispatchable solar and wind products. You can compete with gas, you can compete with coal, and we're seeing that. New York, I think, is a perfect example. Recently, the governor of New York has announced that they're going to relook at whether or not their fleet of peaker plants in the state of New York, which is basically those things that come on at the time when prices spike because energy demand gets to the highest, and they're only needed for certain periods of time out of the year. They're going to reevaluate whether or not it makes sense to keep those plants in place. And then that is in part because you've got things like solar plus storage or even just standalone storage that can step in and take their place. But to really make it work, and this is really getting to the heart of your question, we need to make sure that the energy markets are able to accommodate renewables. Thinking back, and to do that, there's a couple of things that need to get done. One, we need more infrastructure. We need more transmission to get built so that we can get these renewable products to market where they need to be. No longer are you going to be wanting just to connect to the utility and sell to the utility where you're building your product here in the US. You want to be able to get to those spot markets and those organized markets where you can actually make money. The other thing you're going to do is we're going to need to look at the market rules, and that's really where we see the activity right now, is trying to figure out, particularly on the wholesale level, is how can we reevaluate the wholesale market rules and make them more accommodating to renewable development. If you think back, wholesale markets, particularly the organized markets here in the United States, were designed with big baseload power plants in mind. These things aren't very flexible, they're very large, but they could provide cheap power. Now we've got smaller renewable projects, flexible and renewable projects when you add in storage, cheaper, that participate in the markets in different ways. And so we've got to reevaluate the wholesale market rules and make sure that the products that are being offered actually make sense in this new technology, in this new modern era of renewable development. The last thing I'll say that we need to do is we need access. And in doing that, part of that is the transmission, part of that is the wholesale market rules, but part of that is thinking about what consumers want and making sure they have the ability to get to those renewable resources in a way that makes sense for everybody. And I say that, very carefully because a lot of the fights, particularly on the state level here in the US, is about whether or not consumers can get access to renewable generation when they want it. In some places, it's a lot easier. In other places where you've got vertically integrated utilities, it's a little bit trickier. And so states are wrestling with that issue, and it's building on something that Nick said, trying to find a way that it makes sense, where it's competitive, where consumers can get to the renewable generation they want, but also recognizing you can't do that in a way that's going to penalize other ratepayers on the grid. So it's making sure that this works in a cohesive way. And you see states here in the US struggling with that, and I see that's really where things go. I'm sure we're going to dig into this, but that's really where we see things going. But I'll say the other thing to add to that is consumers are really going to drive a lot of where this is going. We saw consumers coming to green energy in the past because they wanted to be able to say they're going green, which is very important to a lot of different companies for various different reasons. But now we see consumers getting very savvy and recognizing that not only can they go green, but with these new technologies like renewable and storage, they can manage their energy uses and they can do it in a way that's more economic for their companies. And that's what I think is going to open up a lot of things.
Excellent. I guess one thing I'll just add there is what type of renewable or clean energy product we're looking at. Is it distributed, and so we're talking about a home or a smaller business, in which case, yes, they might own that asset, and that's one set of policies and players, or is it utility owned? And that's a model that I think Arizona is an interesting example for and brings up a lot of different themes. You may recall a couple years ago there was a fight over rooftop solar there, and it's a regulated state, so it's not an open competitive market, but it was interesting trying to open it up to third-party owned solar systems, which the utility objected to. But now Arizona Public Service is adopting renewable energy on its own accord, and they have indeed, they do allow rooftop solar to be deployed, and the utility is coming up with its own new models for offering more clean energy to corporate customers and even homeowners as well, with utility-owned rooftop solar, not just consumer-owned. So thinking about distributed, thinking about large scale, lots of different business models within that to think about, and when it comes to customer choice. The one last thing I'll say about Arizona is another testament to your point about the competitiveness. They just, I think, are about to acquire almost a gigawatt of energy storage on their own accord. This is, again, not an open and free energy market, but they did have a request for proposals and a straight competitive process to find new energy resources, and energy storage beat out new gas plants in that scenario. So a testament, again, to the price declines and then an example of how it's actually playing out in America right now. Let's go back to Denmark. So we talked a little bit about this future with no subsidies. How is Denmark preparing for that future?
Yeah, that's a good question, Julia. And I think I want to pick up on what a couple of the other guys have said here. I think what's really, really important is that you price flexibility in the market, right? So you put the price and flexibility right, and that touches a number of political sort of hotspots. That's one thing. Another thing is vertically integrated utilities. That's history in Europe. We have decided to unbundle our utilities. So the only thing that's monopoly regulated is the grid, because production is not a monopoly source, and the consumer market should not be a monopoly regulated source, right? So basically, to vertically integrate the utility puts a monopoly into a market that should absolutely be free. And I know that in some parts of this country you still have vertically integrated utilities, and that I think makes for an obstacle to the future of renewables, because renewables in the day-to-day market come in at the lowest price. When wind turbines produce, they produce at almost zero marginal cost. They press coal out of that market. They're also cheaper, but that makes for a great case for renewables. The only thing is, what about the intermittency? And I think there it's extremely important that we look into the long-term storage, because short-term storage, batteries, Wind turbine producers are coming online soon with products where they both have sort of short-term storage and the wind production. Great stuff. Then they would be better in the day-to-day market. But when we have a period of 9 days where the wind doesn't blow, we still have an obstacle, right? So we need to look at long-term storage. So I think we have moved in Denmark. We're at about 50% renewables in our power mix, 60%. Moving up to 100% in the next 10, 11 years, it's a completely different ballgame from what we've done so far. So what we're looking at is grid integration. It's integrating the heating system with the power system, with the gas system, with transportation, with the price point of electric vehicles coming down to the right level within what we expect the next 5, 6 years with European car manufacturers. So the integration of the entire energy system is going to be front and center for policymaking in Denmark. And at the same time, continuing to build out interconnectors to countries around us. We see the North Sea as a power hub for Europe. So once we have power to gas at a reasonable price level, we can pipe offshore wind directly into the Ruhr district in Germany through hydrogen channels or methanized power. So that's the future that we're looking into. That's what we're hedging.
I'm just a quick follow-up. Who is the provider of last resort in Denmark? Who provides for customers in this open free market? No.
Well, there is. So if you are an electricity provider, a power provider, you have to sign a contract with a customer that makes it your responsibility to provide that power when they need it, right? So that's still regulated, and where they get the power from, that's their concern, right?
Got it. The U.S. was grappling with that in Nevada. Nevadans make fun of me for getting that one wrong. Sorry. It's my Canadian accent. They had a referendum, and they put it to the voters to decide whether or not to open up that state's power market, and they ultimately decided not to. But then the utility went ahead and is supposed to be procuring a bunch of solar and storage. So you are still seeing even vertically integrated utilities, same with the Arizona example, adopting clean energy. And so the market discussion, I think, is really interesting around free markets and what that role is. David, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see the U.S. opening up more and more? Is that something that's going to become real here?
Yeah, so one of the key, distinctions, I guess, between a lot of European markets and between U.S. markets is the prevalence of states in setting energy policy. We have a very federalized energy policy in the United States, and so much actually sits with state-level policy or with the transmission system operators, independent system operators that govern markets in those states. One of the fascinating things, just to make kind of a political observation that Morten's probably too diplomatic to be able to make, but I'll go ahead and say it, is that you've seen this interesting flip in the politics of energy here in the United States, where the White House has actually gotten more interventionist and more anti-market over time, which is kind of surprising given the party label that it bears. And what states have figured out is to drive, to make progress on their climate goals, to make progress on renewables just writ large, even if it's simply to drive down, customer costs. All they have to do is basically become more pro-market, because the market is, no private investor is thinking about financing a coal plant anymore. A coal plant in New Mexico, is likely to be sold for $1 to an investor that wants to try their hand at retrofitting it with carbon capture and storage and trying to give it a second life. And more power to them. If they can make that work, absolutely. But it shows to you what the current value of the asset is in this market, where it's completely out of the money. So what are the interesting things that states are doing to try and drive this forward? I'll list just a couple categories. Number one, you see a really interesting embrace of clean energy standards, which you can see is somewhat of an evolution from renewable portfolio standards. States are not only increasing those renewable portfolio standards, which, by the way, have been responsible, I think, for driving the lion's share of renewables deployment that we've seen to date. It hasn't been federal government policy. Of course, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit have been important, but state level renewable portfolio standards have also played a role, which basically generate, kind of mandate a certain amount of renewables in the system and then generate credits for those. I think we're seeing a very welcome evolution in that, which is a slightly more ecumenical, slightly more inclusive category of policy, a clean energy standard. This allows for emissions-free nuclear power to compete, head-on with renewables and on the merit of their cost and of their emissions credentials. It allows for the possibility for carbon capture and storage down the road if that proves to be an economic technology. It allows for new technologies not even invented yet to also be able to come in and compete. So it's more technologically inclusive. California was obviously the pioneer in this with the mid-century complete decarbonization of the power sector target that is now legally binding and in state law. But we also see it notably, not just in California and in Hawaii, which followed suit with a similar policy, but we're now seeing it across the central US. We're seeing it in unlikely places. New Mexico's one. New Mexico's a coal and gas-rich state, a fossil fuel state, which the governor of which just signed into law at the end of last week. New Mexico's, first, mid-century decarbonization law. So it's something called the Energy Transition Act, which will get their power sector to zero emissions by mid-century and do it basically through a clean energy standard. The second category that I'll just highlight is, really thoughtful and creative approaches, non-ideological approaches to how do we transition away from our existing asset base in a way that is sustainable and that doesn't leave people behind. I think, and Julie, I'll point to something which is on Green Tech Media right now, actually, which is a great article looking at Colorado as an example of this. A state legislator in Colorado has come up with a very innovative proposal building off of a long history of using securitization, so essentially financial engineering, as a way to more inexpensively retire existing energy assets, power plants. And he's basically applying it to coal and saying, what you have here are coal plants that are out of the money. So, it's actually cheaper to build new renewables, or at the very least to run your existing renewable fleet than to run your existing coal fleet. But that existing coal runs because it's an equity, it sits on the balance sheet of utilities as equity, and it has a guaranteed rate of return. And so it's going to run for as long as that guaranteed rate of return is there. What this is proposing to do is basically using securitization to switch out the more expensive equity that's that represented by those coal plants, and instead, issue credit using the high credit worthiness, the high credit rating of the utility, and swapping that out for credit, which gives you a lower cost of capital, and then frees up the utility to then go and invest in that new generation asset, that new renewable, whether it be onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, et cetera. Invest in that new asset, which then creates a savings for the system. And that savings, this is the role of policymakers then to divvy up that savings. Now that we've saved money for the whole system, what part of that savings goes to the consumer? What part of it goes to the utility? What part of it goes to potentially a program to retrain coal workers so that they're prepared for new and high-paying jobs in other sectors? That's what Colorado's looking at doing, and I think it's a really noteworthy state effort that we should be paying attention to.
Awesome. Yeah, the Colorado example is super interesting, and thanks for giving DTM a shout out on that one. We're also working on a piece now looking closer at the New Mexico case you mentioned. They also had some innovative language in there about not leaving coal workers behind or other people affected by the transition to clean. So if you're interested in that, take a closer look at New Mexico. I wanted to go back to the first point, or the initial point you made there, David, and put it to you, Nick, about clean energy standards. Those have been propelling states forward. But in some states that operate in regional transmission grids, it has become very controversial because they say these clean energy standards that encourage the deployment of renewables are messing with open and free markets. And nuclear is a particular sticking point there because some states like Illinois offer credits for nuclear power. And so if you ask PJM, the regional grid operator, they say that that's sending the wrong signal into the market. Illinois, now as a side note, is currently considering a 100% renewable energy law, so not even clean. So removing nuclear in a state that has the most nuclear of any state in the country is looking at even going renewable. That might be interesting for other reasons, given that nuclear might be retiring by 2050. But go back to today's market settings, talk about clean energy standards and what that means for free markets.
Yeah, at Heritage, we're not big fans of renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards. And if you look at what some of the states are doing to incorporate nuclear plants, whether it's in Illinois, potentially in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and as well as in New York, I think you're creating an additional barrier to entry for new renewable projects. And so it's already difficult for renewable projects to enter into these markets, and by adding an additional layer of protection by subsidizing these coal-fired power, renewable power plants, but also potentially coal-fired power plants, if you consider what the Department of Energy was considering over the past year and a half, that becomes an additional barrier to entry, which is also problematic. And so I see the clean energy standards and the renewable portfolio standards, as essentially what could be a floor for the future of renewables in open competitive markets. And I think if you don't have the right elements of competition and price signals, you may get some of the least economical sources of energy, whether it's existing nuclear plants or even some of the renewable power generation entering into the market rather than having the low bidders enter into the market. And that's been the case with PURPA as well. You've seen that in cases with PURPA that you're not actually getting the lowest bidders into the market, and that becomes an opportunity cost for the more competitive sources, whether it's wind, solar, or something else. So to me, all of these market distortions just continue to add more layers of barrier to what are the more competitive elements of the renewable energy sector. And so that's why, what we'd like to see is an end of those policies rather than continuing them along or ramping them up, and then getting to what William talked about was how can we get better rules for organized markets that allow new entry, whether it's for better price formation, changing eligibility requirements, things that actually allow these projects to compete in better organized markets without just meeting some sort of arbitrary standard that's defined by politicians.
I want to ask you, I'm going to ask you about free markets and the role of FERC in just a moment. Nick, I want to ask you the tough question of, you mentioned national security being of interest, and this administration has brought up nuclear in the context of national security and resilience. But of course, that would upset the free market paradigm that you're talking about. And David went there and mentioned how it's interesting to have among the Republican Party a divide on this issue. Can you tackle that a little bit? What do you think is happening here?
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between Republican and conservative and Republican and free market a lot of the times, and you've seen that with this administration when it comes to energy policy and the proposed notice of proposed rulemaking to potentially bail out these coal and nuclear plants when it's been pretty clearly assessed that there's no real national security benefit or even a grid resiliency and reliability benefit from keeping these power plants online. It is more about politics rather than energy economics and policy. Similarly with solar tariffs and potentially with uranium tariffs as well. These are not policies that are enhancing national security by any means. They are just distorting markets and hurting, in large part, American companies. One is now going through Chapter 11 and another that was acquired, and the company that acquired SolarWorld doesn't even really want the tariffs. So they have said that it's marginally helped us, but it's come at a great cost too. So I think every time you have something done under the auspices of national security, you have to look at what are the actual national security benefits you're getting from. And there's been instances where, for renewables, it hasn't generated much national security benefit either. I think the use of biofuels in the Air Force and the Navy have been extremely expensive, and I don't think there's been much national security justification for using those fuels either. So I think it really comes down to, are you actually generating any type of national security benefit from these policies? If not, then they don't make sense.
Great, thanks for taking that on. Will, we talked about the role of regional grid operators. Then there's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they are looking at the role of markets in the U.S. and how renewables fit in, and how storage fits in, and how distributed energy resources fit in. Can you walk us through some of the ways they're looking at the rise of renewables and clean tech and factoring that into their free market or into their market?
I definitely can, but I actually want to touch on something that Nick just said, because talking about subsidies and talking about the subsidies that are coming from the states, zero emission credits, which is the ZECs that are coming out of Illinois and New Jersey and potentially Pennsylvania and Ohio, depending on how things are going, and how they're impacting the markets. And then, if you're looking at, thinking about subsidies and taking away the subsidies for renewables, and you just think across the board, now we're thinking about putting subsidies out there for coal plants as well. And it's causing significant disruption to the markets where, there's been litigation. You were mentioning PJM. The litigation at PJM has been going on for, the current litigation is over a year old, but the litigation about how you structure the capacity markets to deal with the subsidies that the states and different policymakers are putting on and how that's affecting market prices and market signals has been ongoing. And it's extremely disruptive when you're trying to create a competitive environment. And that's something you have to think about with the renewables too, because if you're going to start peeling away some of the subsidies for the renewables, but creating subsidies in other places, that creates a disadvantage for renewables. And I was talking with somebody yesterday, and they were saying, when you're looking at these markets, how you define subsidies is all in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, because you can think about a bunch of different ways where different types of technologies are being promoted by state policies, and that impacts a competitive market. I mean, to have a truly competitive market, you would just pull away all the regulation. No one's going to do that in the energy sector, but it's a difficult balance to be able to kind of walk that space. Mm-hmm. And so, it's very interesting you were mentioning that, and that's something that is a constant struggle. And I'll get into FERC, because where FERC in particular, FERC, for those in the room, and I'll try not to get too wonky here, I tend to do that when I talk about FERC policy, but FERC controls the wholesale markets and sets the rules at the federal level, but they also are significantly, the states are controlling the retail markets here in the US, and so there's this constant tension between how states are setting policy and how FERC is setting policy and how they're having to interact with the markets. And so that's a constant ongoing thing, and that's where the subsidies come in. But FERC is really, sorry, Julia, it was a long-winded, now I'll get to your question, but
go for it.
FERC is really kind of looking at renewables and doing a number of different things that I think are helping renewables and creating more of an environment. You mentioned, so I'll tick off some highlight things, and if folks have questions, we can dig into them. I don't want to get too wonky, but FERC, one of the things that FERC has recognized is the importance of technology. So you mentioned energy storage. FERC has out there, FERC likes to do things by number, right? So the biggest FERC order was actually Order 888, which is where FERC is located. It's their address. So 88 First Street. So that's their...
FERC is so fun.
That's right.
It gets a bad rap.
They're big order.
Well, that was.
But Order 841 is a new order that FERC came out for energy storage, and it was designed to open up the markets, to require, you were mentioning the grid operators, to establish rules that would allow energy storage to compete at the same level as other types of products that can also participate in the markets. And so we see that's going through the process right now. The order came out about a year ago. Each of the grid operators have come in and come up with their market rules, and that's what's going on right now. But we see that as creating an opportunity for energy storage, which is going to, more storage that comes onto the system is going to make it more advantageous for renewables. So it's going to create a better marketplace for renewables. So I would say that is definitely one thing that we're watching as a way to create opportunity. The other thing that FERC has been looking at, one of the biggest complaints from the renewable developers here in the United States is getting access to their ability to interconnect to the grid. There's just so much projects trying to come online in different places, and it's a very competitive environment. And so the renewable developers have been talking to the regulators and trying to get FERC to look at their interconnection rules and how they're going to open that up or try to streamline that process, make it more advantageous for developers to get some of their generation online. And FERC just issued another number, 845, which was designed to help kind of rethink at how that interconnection queue is going to work. One really interesting thing that came out of that, talking about solar plus storage, is in the past, when you're connecting to the grid, you are going to have to pay for all the necessary things that need to be done to the grid to be able to get your generator online. That can be very expensive. So if you have a 50 megawatt project, you're going to have to pay for the upgrades to accommodate your 50 megawatt project. If you stick a 20 megawatt battery there, now you're looking at 70 megawatts that you're going to have to pay for. One thing that FERC is looking to do there in their new rules is to say, we're going to allow you to be more creative as to how you're sizing your projects. So if you've got a 50 megawatt solar project and a 20 megawatt battery, you're really only going to operate that thing at 50 megawatts. So that's all we're going to, if you're going to be willing to guarantee that that's all you're going to put on the grid, that's all we're going to make it pay for. And I think that's really going to open up the door for things like dispatchable energy or dispatchable solar. That's going to make things happen. The other thing that FERC is looking at, you're talking about different technologies, and I'll stop because, as you can see, I get on a roll when I get wonky with FERC. Distributed energy resources, figuring out ways that the distribution level, solar projects, storage projects, wind, even gas, how that can interact with the wholesale market. FERC has been wrestling with that for a while because they're concerned about making sure that the revenue streams don't get double counted. You're not dipping in the retail revenue space, but taking from the wholesale revenue space as well. Talking to some of the commissioners, there's been a NOPR going on for a while. I think we're very encouraged that we're going to see FERC do something in that space to set some rules out to make it more advantageous for distributed solar or distributed renewable generation to be able to get more access to the grid. So that's something we're looking at as well.
Great. You all have all the material you need for your next cocktail party now.
Yeah.
Bring that one up. Okay, let's go back to Denmark, because I think it kind of relates here. Part of the key to Denmark's success has been integrating renewables in the liquid market for power trading. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Mm-hmm. So what we do have is we have, as I said before, a marketplace, a Nord Pool, which includes now 13 countries, all the way down to France. And it's a day-to-day wholesale market, which is regulated by price only. So it's an energy-only market. And so that's the basics of it. And I think that's at the core of where we've gotten to today. But taking us further on is a different thing, right? So we need to build out that market even further with the rest of Europe. And the European legislation calls for that. It pushes that integration of markets. So that's where we're going. But I want to come back to a couple of things that was said before, if I may, Julia. One is about I think that was you, David, who said the inflexible legacy utilities, the coal-fired power plants, the nuclear power plants. And that rang something in my head because Ørsted, who's now going for completely green utility, first in the world, came from a completely black coal-based utility back 25 years ago. And they've made that transformation. And they did that out of the Danish market. So what actually made that happen? Well, that was regulation. That was opening up the market and making sure that prices were set right. And that made for a push on the utility to actually ramp up and down coal-fired power plants. So they now can ramp their coal-fired capacity from 100 to 15% within hours. I know that there are some of the US coal-fired power plants that are older than that and may not be able to ramp down to 15%, but there's a ramp capacity there that can be touched on if the market incentives are right. And the same as I just heard the other day goes for nuclear. I thought that was completely base load, but that can be ramped to some effect up and down as well if the incentives are there. And there again, back to not having vertically integrated utilities, opening up the marketplace, I think that's extremely important. The other thing that was touched on, I think that was Will, was the consumer push and the fact that you actually now have companies that call for green energy. We see that in Denmark too. We have in our new energy deal in Parliament that's backed by all of Parliament in this socialist country, right to left. We have a target of 100% renewables in the power mix in 2030. As I said, 95% renewables in the heating sector. And I think in that's important, but offshore wind is 3 gigawatts out of that capacity build out. What we see coming online, and may come online within the next 3, 4, 5 years, is 3.5 gigawatt of PPA-based, non-subsidized renewables. So our TSO is grappling with this now. Do we have the right market signals, the right incentives to get those 3.5 gigawatt on the grid where it's cost competitive and makes sense for the marketplace and for the consumers, and keep the rates low, keep the tariffs low? So that's another challenge, and that's a new challenge. We didn't see that before because now we have subsidy-free renewables. So I think what we're going to be grappling with in the future are a completely different set of challenges. One is public support. So we know that people don't want to look at infrastructure. certainly don't want to look at energy infrastructure. We've seen that with high power lands in Denmark. We see that with onshore wind. We even see it with near-shore, offshore wind. So that challenge needs to be dealt with. How do we deal with that? How do we have a constructive dialogue with local communities on this build-out? The opportunities that there are in growth. If you build a 1 gigawatt offshore wind park, it's 8,200 jobs for that local economy. So that's a good thing, but you have to look at the stuff, right? So that balance, how do you strike that? I think, so the public consultation is going to be really, really important. And as I said before, storage, getting the price down on power to gas, really, really important. So we're looking at a completely different set of challenges going forward than what we've looked at in the past.
All right. I'm going to ask a level set question here, but first, start thinking of your questions. I'm going to start asking folks. You don't have to save them all for the end. I'll do a couple rounds. So start thinking them up in your minds, and I'll come to you guys in a moment. I guess, David, this is kind of a tricky question, but just we're talking about 100% mandates and laws, and so government interaction there, talking about certain subsidies that have propelled the market forward, other ways that the market or governments get involved in setting the market rules, and yet we're talking about free markets and hands-off and competitive. Can you thread the needle on where the government gets involved and where it doesn't? What is the system that is ideal in your view?
Yeah, so I think where we're going with all of this, if you can draw out a common thread between all the different comments, you're talking about moving to a place where there are so many different new technologies. There are new models, distributed resources, right, renewable resources, clean baseload, dirty baseload, et cetera, that you're moving more to a place where the traditional construct was not a open and equal platform upon which all technologies could dance and compete. It was a government utility interplay that allowed for large centralized generation plants to be deployed, to be run for long lifetimes, 30 to 50 years, and for cost recovery, regulated cost recovery off of that. The market has evolved, and now it's time for regulation to catch up. The common thing I think we could all agree on is there's tons of value being created by these new technologies, right? But that value, number one, has to be harnessed. So we have to make sure that we are seeing investment decisions, we're seeing planning decisions that maximize the value that can theoretically be harvested with technologies we have here today. And then the role of regulation is to not only ensure that we're harvesting all that value, but then to decide how is it divvied up. This goes to how do we decommission or take coal, uneconomic coal plants out of the market in a way that, and then how do we take the value that's created by that and share it amongst different stakeholders. And that's going to be an ongoing discussion and an ongoing deliberation. Nick hit on a really good point, though, which is fossil fuel subsidies and subsidies, writ large, are an interesting place to start. You've got about $500 billion worth of, energy subsidies. About 100 billion of those are renewable, at least by last count that I looked at, or for clean energy. 400 billion of those are oil and gas. So you've got, 80% of the existing subsidy base globally for energy is oil and gas. A level playing field, all things being equal, should probably tilt in the direction of those technologies that are already cheaper and offer attributes that are attractive to the market. The idea here that regulation is not always an anti-competitive thing, and that regulation can in fact lead and drive competition, is I think the key takeaway from Denmark. I'll just finish by noting that it's fascinating. You see here today, there's a National Governors Association summit about to kick off at the end of this week, an Energy Solutions Summit, which is about engaging governors and states with international leaders in certain energy technologies and certain components of the energy market. And Denmark was chosen to help governors think through how they drive a robust and vibrant offshore wind industry here in the United States. Those are the kind of conversations that need to be taking place. And it's not because governors want more expensive costs of energy. It's because they've seen what Denmark has been able to do in terms of driving competition, and competition in turn driving down costs and delivering new benefits to the grid. And it's important that I think governors work together to help drive that here along the Atlantic coast and potentially even the west coast of the U.S.
Oh yeah, that'll be exciting to watch offshore wind in America. I'm sure your companies are getting excited since there's not actually a ton of expertise domestically in the U.S. there. But I look forward to looking out from LA and seeing wind turbines at some point. Nick, because David kind of teed that up, you mentioned moving to a no subsidy future for renewables or any energy source. How does that get done? We're in DC, this is where the sausage gets made, but how do you go after those fossil fuel subsidies, many of which are baked so deeply in the tax code?
That's a great question. I feel like what was it, Staples that had that easy button that you just had to hit and like everything was done, or like the Men in Black flashy pen maybe, to make people forget that we had all these energy subsidies.
That happened.
Yeah, exactly.
I would have no work. You can't do that.
It's a challenge, because the public choice element of subsidies is that once these policies are put in place, they're very difficult to remove because you have the entrenched interests that stand to benefit from them, and then you're dispersing the costs amongst the rest of us. And so you have a very narrow focus for the politicians and the companies that stand to benefit from these policies working really hard to keep them in place. And you see that with utilities and competition too, which is what happened in Nevada and what's happening in Virginia as well, to prevent competition. So you could try and lump all of the subsidies together, which is a challenge in and of itself, because how do you define a subsidy? If you define it as the government, distorting energy markets, then you have to talk about Price Anderson, and you have to talk about the loan guarantees and the targeted tax credits and some of the marginal well production tax credits that have been in our code for a long time now. But then you get an aggregation of all of those companies who are against any type of reform banding together. And so my hope is that you can create strange bedfellows to move policy forward. I think what you're starting to see, at least when it comes to electricity choice competition, is that there are different circles with overlapping principles that are starting to talk to one another. And you have the conservative and the free market organizations talking to some of the environmental groups who may not like first generation ethanol, or who are disappointed with the utilities as much as conservatives are. And I think once you start to create those strange bedfellows, then you start to move the needle a little bit more, as well as getting some of the other bigger companies and industrials on board. If you have some of the big industrial companies who are very large employers, and you have the Walmarts and the Googles of the world clamoring for the right types of policies, at least when it comes to competition and choice, I think that's when you start to see some sort of aggregated force that really tends to perk the ears of politicians in ways that you haven't been able to move the needle before. That said, it's obviously a very big challenge. Even when some of these subsidies were expired, they came back retroactively and it still exists. So I'm not saying it would be easy, but I think you're starting to see some sort of needle, especially now that renewable sources are competitive with traditional forms of energy. Hopefully we can start to move the needle away from all of these entrenched subsidies.
You teed up the point on corporate customers perfectly in those comments, so thank you for that. Will, let's go to you. In recent years, we've seen corporate renewable energy procurement explode. The Rocky Mountain Institute has a great webpage, the Renewable Energy Business Council, I think it's called. I'm forgetting the exact acronym, but if you go to the Rocky Mountain Institute's website, they track all the corporate renewable energy procurements, and you can just see how in 2018, I believe it was 8 gigawatts, and Will, you can fact check me on this. But talk about the state of the corporate renewables market in the US. What's driving that growth? Expound upon that a little bit more.
So I think a couple of things. I keep doing this, but I want to touch on something that Morgan said that actually triggered something in my head as we were talking about this. He was talking, and this is part of that question, he was talking about 3.5 gigawatts of PPA backed renewable generation coming onto the grid and trying to figure out how to deal with that. And that's one thing we haven't talked about here today is how, as this new technology, whether it be distributed, whether it be utility scale storage, all these things coming on, you still got to operate the grid. And you still have to have a reliable and a resilient grid. And so we keep talking about, I know this panel is very focused on markets and what we're doing to make markets work so that makes these things economic. But the overlay of all of that is trying to figure out how you do this in a way that makes sure that the lights stay on as well. And that drives some of the economics to some of this as well. I talked about transmission needing to be built. But that's a struggle that the policymakers are also struggling with all of this behind the scenes. So I think that's a really good point about how do we deal with this new world and how do we deal with things are going? And kind of pivoting into the corporates, we do see a ton of activity in the corporate space. In the US, I think it may have been 2018, but 2018 was the first year where corporate energy purchases were higher than utility purchases of renewable energy generation, which was sort of a watershed moment. And you see more and more corporate entities looking for the ability to get more renewable generation. And as I mentioned, I think a lot of things that is driving that is because it is good for them. They want to do a socially good thing for the environment. They're very more socially responsible as to how they're looking at things. And so that's a lot of what's kind of driving that policy. But I think what we're seeing, at least, as more and more corporate entities are taking control over what they're doing, sort of it started out as wanting to go green and get renewable generation. Now they're realizing that they can actually manage their businesses and manage their energy uses by being more savvy about how they're thinking about their corporate energy use, whether distributed generation, whether it's using storage, whether it's using a biomass facility because that makes sense for the economics of whatever business they're doing. We're talking to some folks that are actually putting gas on their system, distributed gas because it's easier and it's cheaper. And so they're looking at all these different things to figure out how can they make themselves more economic, because for a lot of these companies, energy use is one of their biggest expenditures. And so as they get more and more comfortable, and this was the big thing that our corporate energy sourcing group would tell you to get them over the hump, is getting used to the risk that they would have to deal with by getting more involved in these long-term power purchase agreements. I mean, corporate entities aren't liking to have to sign up for their energy use for 10, 12, 15-year contracts. That's not something that they're used to doing. So as they get more comfortable doing that here in the US, you're seeing them start to get more comfortable about looking at other things they can do in their energy space. And I'll just say, and it's not just here in the US, it is actually, this is talking about international policy. I think the corporate area, in a lot of ways, renewable policy in Europe and some of the places overseas drove a lot, particularly with offshore wind, drove a lot what's going on in the US. I think the corporate wave here in the US is actually starting to drive what's going on overseas outside of the United States. Absolutely. We have seen a number of companies that have been very successful here looking to make pivots to cover their energy use outside of the US. I think a perfect example of that is recently Nike announced their 40 megawatt deal with Iberdrola. We actually helped them with that project, to help them with that deal, but that covers their energy use in Europe. And they've done some deals here in the US, and they're able to kind of pivot to Europe to cover their use there. And we're seeing more and more interest in Europe, in Asia, in Australia. But each time you go to a different country, you've got to unpack that regulatory scheme to figure out how that makes it work. And that's kind of was the struggle here in the US, and that's really what we see, people kind of trying to figure out. In a lot of ways, things that they did here in the US, they can replicate, but you got to figure out, okay, how does that fit into this scheme? It's almost like dealing with each of the different states here in the US.
Great.
Julie, can I just add on to that real quick? Because, I think the corporate story is really interesting, particularly if you look at what you could think of and conceptualize as the largest corporation in the United States, which would be the Department of Defense if it were a corporation, right? So DoD owns or manages 500,000 buildings. It manages square footage, which is 3 times the square footage that Walmart manages. It's the largest purchaser of energy in the United States. And I think it's really interesting to see the U.S. military as well really start to see the value of distributed and advanced energy resources, both from an installation perspective. So look at Fort Hood, which is the largest active duty armored post in the United States, which moved about half its or contracted solar and wind to provide about half of its power. And then you also see the military increasingly embrace new energy services models. So this is where a company was hired, a private company was hired in Parris Island, South Carolina, to basically provide additional resilience of that base because of all the threats they face from, indeed, climate-driven extreme weather events and flooding and high water risk, et cetera, they basically said we need to be able to have additional resiliency and redundancy in our energy system on the base. And so instead of doing it all themselves, because as we all know, the Department of Defense sometimes doesn't have the best reputation for procurement and management of processes like this, you have other providers, energy services companies stepping in and basically guaranteeing resilience as a service or performance as a service. It's almost like the Department of Defense acting like a regulator and demanding performance-based regulation. I think that's a model that we may see more and more of, not only from the military, from corporates as well, that may prefer to deal with this through an intermediary like an energy services company, and also universities as another block here. So another good transatlantic story. Engie, a French company, has completed what's the largest, I think, energy services contract in the United States to date, perhaps in the world to date, a 50-year contract with Ohio State to take over all of Ohio State University's energy services and energy management. That includes a $1 billion plus upfront payment to Ohio State, and basically says, we'll pay you, we're going to take over all of your energy, you'll pay us this kind of annual fee going forward, and we're going to deliver a ton of value because we know how to optimize every single aspect of your energy system to do it all better and at lower cost. And we're going to continue to invest as new technologies become available. That's a way that large customers can outsource the cutting edge of the energy market to others.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that, you mentioned universities, which we're seeing a lot of activity in, but I'll add cities to that list as well. You see cities and municipalities looking at ways to do the exact same thing, figuring out ways that they can manage their energy use. So it's a growing trend.
Great. I was just going to fact check myself on the Rocky Mountain website. Check out the Business Renewables Center, and last year the U.S. did 6.5 gigawatts of renewables, of corporate renewables. And to your point about other products that are forming around this customer demand, there are also insurance products basically for corporate renewables where they can guarantee exactly how much generation is going to be delivered based on weather patterns, and so that corporate customer can have the confidence that they're going to get exactly what they're buying, and they don't have to deal with the intermittency issues. So a company, Resurety, is doing some interesting stuff there. I want to put it to the audience now. Does anyone have any questions? Just raise a hand, and I believe we have a microphone coming around, or I'll just repeat it. Yeah. Oh, there is a microphone in.
Yeah.
Hi, Blake Wilcox.
Doesn't seem to be on, but I can repeat it if you want to.
Yeah.
I'll just speak up. Blake Wilcox, Capital Policy Center. I think, David, you mentioned several different modalities of renewable energy, photovoltaics, onshore wind, offshore wind. One thing that I didn't hear about that I'm very interested in the potential of is floating solar, so-called photovoltaics. And I was wondering what all of you think about the potential of this new technology and what its role in the energy mix might become. Thank you.
So just in case the live stream can't hear, I'm not totally sure. Questions about the future of floating solar, photovoltaics as they're called. What is the potential that the panelists see for that? David, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So just quickly, thank you for your question. And I imagine it's generated in part by the fact that there's an exciting new project for floating PV in Azerbaijan, I believe, which was just announced recently. I think this is, it hits at something that we haven't really touched on today, which is kind of, okay, if you're going to go for a more, kind of let the free market just deliver, kind of where the energy system's going, what the, the technologies that the system and the consumers want to see. What's the role for additional research and development? What's the role for additional innovation? And I think there is still a huge role, and this is perhaps where the government does come in, right? Is government can maybe get out of some of these markets a little bit and in turn invest more time, more resources into doing what it does best, which is the kind of basic research and development, as well as kind of the next wave of initial commercialization that's needed to get new technologies to market that'll allow us to use, let's say, certain parts of our land mass that would otherwise be undevelopable for renewable resources or for any clean energy resource. Floating solar is just one of many. Another one in the solar field are advanced solar technologies, thin film, perovskite solar, which ideally you'd eventually be able to just print solar at extremely low cost from an inkjet printer, or design houses where you don't have to put things on roofs. It's just integrated into the building materials. There are a lot of interesting innovations going on, including at our own National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, here in the United States. And I'll just tee up Morten a little bit as well by saying that one of the largest contributions I think Denmark's going to make in this area is on floating offshore wind, which I note more and more companies are looking to as they get a little bit deeper out, or they get into kind of some different circumstances offshore.
Do you want to add to that, actually?
No, I'm happy to. I think floating solar photovoltaics is probably not something that we're going to invest heavily in Denmark, but for many reasons. One of them is that the sun doesn't shine. But basically, and we have a lot of solar online that we pay a lot of subsidies for anyways. But I think what's really important is that we continue to invest in research and development and making new technologies ready for the market. But I think not so much on the production side in the Danish context, more in the grid integration side, the market integration side, more in system integration, distribution, storage, primarily. Those are the areas that we'll hit hard.
Nick, do you want to take 2 seconds to talk about because you mentioned taking some issue with the role of NREL and the government interference. Does that extend to this new developments in technology, or do you support that?
It does. So, I would probably differ in David's assessment as to what the role of DOE should be, in that, I don't think it's the role of the federal government to drive down the costs of specific technologies. I think that's for the market to determine. And so, if you look at the subsidies that are out there, yes, I think they probably helped decrease the cost of wind and solar over time, but we've also had those subsidies available for a long time, and the cost decreases came down more recently. So I think there was some contributing factor of the subsidy reducing those costs, but I don't think it was as causal as some people purported to be. So what I see is this floating solar, or whatever the technology may be, stresses the importance of getting rid of the subsidies to begin with, because if you craft subsidies that are to specific technologies, and floating solar isn't one of them, then resources that could otherwise be allocated to floating solar may not be available, and they may go to some uncompetitive projects that would only be successful with those subsidies. And so when I see, again, the role of the Department of Energy or our DoD research facilities, I like that focus to be more on national security needs, not attempting to drive down the costs of specific technologies.
Morten, anything you want to add to that?
I just wanted to bring in a reflection, because there are various reasons that we now have wind on cost parity with coal and even cheaper. And one of them is that Denmark has invested quite heavily in research and development of wind technology for quite a while. I think and that has driven down cost, of course. But what really drove down costs was the opening of a bigger global market, and that came online because of climate change, right? So what really got the people at Ørsted, the gold guys there, to think about how can we drive down cost of this technology, and not only the technology, but primarily the supply chain, was the opening of the British market, the opening of the German market, the opportunity to sell into those markets. So I don't think change will not come about without investment, and some of that has to be government driven, at least in a socialist perspective, right? But you have to sort of hedge what you need in the future, and we thought for energy security reasons back in the 70s that we needed different energy technologies, and that's why we invested heavily in wind and in biomass, incineration, and so forth. But once it's online and once it's in the marketplace and can compete, we should completely draw back, and that's what we're doing right now.
A question here in the front, second row.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Walter Jurasek. With the renewable energy or classic energy, there is always side and effect, and it's a system of engineering. My background is engineering. Now, I'd like to ask you about the human factor in the sense of the habit of usage of energy. Some countries, they barely can afford any energy, so they quite save a lot. They turn off the lights, turn off every time they go sleep. I drive in Tyson's Corner, empty buildings, full of energy, full of lights. So my question is, can we deal with it, and can we somehow educate those corporations and the energy usage? And I'd like to, Mr. Morton, ask you a favor. Can you tell me a little bit about your success? And I know one town in Denmark is almost 90% or something renewable energy. This is a success. So can you tell us more about that? Thank you.
Okay, so let's maybe go in that order. Tell us about the town, that is in Denmark that's 90% renewables, if that's correct.
I think it's probably an island. It's Samsø, and that's an island in Denmark that decided some years ago to transform completely to renewable energy, and they are now an almost
you make it economic for people to change their behavior. You see that, when you're talking about turning off lights, a little simplistic example, but you can, demand response is a product that was created around the fact that we're going to make it economic for people to shut down their energy use at different times during the day because they can save money for the grid, and we're going to pay them to do it. And so, you see time of use rates as ways to do that, where, make it more advantageous for people to think about their energy usage and how they're using their energy when they're turning on their washing machines, when they're plugging in their electric vehicles, when they're doing how you can cycle up and down your water heater in ways you send a price signal, right? And that's where a market can really kind of incentivize people to do things. I mean, I don't know that you need a subsidy to do that. I think, with market rules and market signals, you can do it.
Did you want to add to that?
No, what he said.
All right.
And I'll
Look
just,
at this, consensus, everyone's building consensus.
I'll jump in there too, but also add that I think that modern behavioral economics probably tells us as well that we can't count on, Homo economicus to harvest all the, the potential benefits here. But I'll still stay in Nick's camp and say that I think that this is a role for, private sector innovation enabled by the right framework that allows it to happen can drive this. So think of, I've got a Nest thermostat in my home. There are a lot of smart thermostats like the Nest thermostat out there today. Indeed, the equivalent to, I believe, if the numbers are correct, the equivalent of basically, 50 nuclear plants worth of demand response capacity represented by those Nest thermostats that are out there in the United States. The vast majority of those are not being used for much more than, the very basic usage. What do you do to unlock that 50 gigawatts plus of demand response capacity? That's a private sector innovation problem working inside of a regulatory framework which is flexible enough, and perhaps it starts with like a regulatory sandbox in a certain community where you can let people experiment a little bit, let companies experiment with some things that you might not get away with in the heavily regulated, broader utility regulatory framework. And if it works there, then you allow it to scale up. And maybe it's something where you opt people in and they can opt themselves out or something like that. But this is where private sector innovation, working with the right regulatory framework, it can absolutely unlock what are already a huge amount of distributed energy resources that we're not capitalizing on.
And I would just broadly and quickly add, access to information is paramount too. I mean, it's access to information on price signals, but also you can have the private sector nudging people to make energy efficient investments. And there's companies out there that will look at your neighbor's home energy use, and if you have a similar style house, say this is what they use on their energy, here's what you could do to reduce the amount you pay in your electricity bill every month. And so I think there's a lot of private sector innovation that can happen to provide better access to information to allow consumers to make those decisions or not make those decisions if they don't want to.
Did you have
Yeah, two reflections from my side on this. And one thing we haven't talked about is digitalization of the energy sector, and I think that's paramount going forward. And in that, access to data and free access to data, right? So everybody can get access to consumer data, and that I think is important because the utilities sit on that data today. That's a big source of income for them to have that data. So I think that's something that's on our mind, something we're grappling with, and that we have to get our arms around going forward. Another thing that has been front and center of my mind for many years is why haven't anyone made a business case on providing me with a utility service? So basically, I pay a fee every month for somebody taking care of all utilities in my home. There may be I think there's a market for that. And and I've asked my people again and again, are there any regulatory barriers to people doing this? And I haven't had a response so far, but I'll continue to push that because I think that also will drive forward some of the things that we're talking about in energy efficiency, in integrating renewables into the market, in distribution, in collecting flexibility at the local level, right? And presenting that to the grid. I think there's a great bunch of opportunity in that, but that's something that we also have to dig into in Denmark. And going back to what David said about the sandboxes, that is actually in the Danish energy bill. That's something we're going to work with over the coming years, establishing those sandboxes for local communities to try things out.
I hope sandbox is in that language. But to connect the dots on the distributed energy point, what you're seeing now too is aggregating all those distributed energy resources. Right. California has rules now that allow this, and I know FERC is looking at this too. Get all those devices and distributed energy resources together, accumulate them, and you can actually bid them into the wholesale markets as an asset. So early days for that, but seeing all these markets kind of tie together now.
And when you start plugging in a bunch of electric vehicles to the grid, it's really going to transform that type of product.
And there's a question over here.
Hi, Emily Felt with Duke Energy, one of the largest power companies in the country. David, I'm picking up on some differences of opinion with Nick, and I wondered if you all had any differences of opinion on what to do with the federal mandate to buy renewable energy at premium prices, PURPA. Nick, you mentioned that. What's our next step here? 20% of all solar in the United States last year, thanks to your numbers, Julia, were as a result of this federal mandate. It is often at premium prices to what could be procured through competitive processes. What's the next step?
Yeah, I'll start, and I just have two quick thoughts. One, I think we'd like to get rid of PURPA altogether, especially now in this time with low-cost competition. I think in most instances with PURPA, it essentially backfires for the long-term development of renewables because it's those uncompetitive projects that procure the winning bids. And so I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So I think the best hope is for modernization that allows for more competitive processes, that allows for those lowest cost renewable projects to actually win
Can you
the
say what
bid.
PURPA is super quickly as a level set, just the basis, the basics?
David, do you want to take that?
So everyone's on the same page.
Or maybe you should, since...
Yeah, it's Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, which is essentially it establishes standards that if you can qualify and wind as a particular type of facility at a certain size, and wind and solar do that, renewable energy does do that, you're able to, basically the utility has to buy power from you at what's called an avoided cost, so it establishes a cost rate. So that's kind of the backdrop of what we're talking about, whether or not that makes sense.
Great.
And I'll just, so I'll second that. I think reform of PURPA, reform of this obligation to buy what may not be the most competitive, renewable resource, clean resource, needs reform. I think I'll just make the note as well that this is really not a political, either side of the aisle issue. There is a really great op-ed that I saw in a conservative publication, the National Review, with 2 former commissioners, one a Democrat, one a Republican, arguing why this is important to do. I'll also, again, point to the states. Look at Colorado. Xcel Energy, another utility in Colorado, made a lot of headlines earlier, or last year in 2018, soliciting bids for, in a very competitive way, soliciting bids for solar, wind, as well as solar plus storage. We saw a solar plus storage winning bid come in at $36 per megawatt hour, right? 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Those are incredible numbers to be delivered in 2021, but it shows what driving competition can do for driving down the costs of these exciting new technologies. And we need this because this is quasi-dispatchable solar, right? What's happened since, though, is one of the losing bidders in that is now suing that utility, Xcel Energy, saying that it violated PURPA and that Xcel Energy was obligated to buy it even if it came in at a higher price. And so I think that just common sense would tell you that we need reform here. The system, whether it's consumers or utilities or whoever the different stakeholders are in this symbiotic system, we shouldn't be digesting technologies that are simply inferior or bids that are higher priced for no reason. And it's time to reform that in a sensible and bipartisan way.
I feel like the problem is a lot of things need to be reformed, but reforms happen so slowly that people are hesitant to let them go for fear of what the vacuum that might be created. And here we are, having lots more panels.
Sandboxes.
Yeah, sandboxes. Okay, we have time for one last question up front here.
I'm Augustine Cruz. I'm an independent consultant here in the DC area, and I wanted to go back to something
There we go.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to something that Will brought up in passing toward the end of your last comment, which is the rise in popularity of EVs. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know, it's kind of a general question, your thoughts, everybody's thoughts about how the growth of the EV market, the adoption of the EV market, so many car makers are now saying that very soon that's all they're going to manufacture. How does that square with, I think, a previous comment that you made about we have to pay attention to the grid and the grid capacity and its resilience? Things like Electrify America, which are trying to build out an entire national network specifically for charging electric vehicles.
Sure, and you're exactly right. I mean, the growth of electric vehicles is coming, and we see, I think China is probably the biggest driver of that right now. One thing that's going to do is going to drive down the cost of utility scale energy storage, right? Batteries are going to get cheaper. So that's going to make a change, but you're right. I mean, what the grid operators need to be doing, and that's what I mentioned before, the resiliency and the reliability, is trying to figure out how they're going to deal with that, and that's going to take a combination of the utilities who are operating the grid operators in the wholesale markets in some places, and the regulators figuring out how they can accommodate those usage with enough infrastructure, with enough policies in place that can manage those energy uses. When you've got a bunch of, everybody comes home at night and wants to plug in their electric vehicle and charge it, you're going to need to make sure that the grid is able to accommodate that. Or if it's not, you're going to need to be able to send the right price signals to kind of, affect behavior in a way that allows the grid to continue to reliably operate. And that's something that folks are wrestling with. But you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that is definitely something that as we move into this kind of electrification of everything, we got to figure out how we're going to manage that. And I think the utilities are going to play a vital role in that.
I'm going to, as the last question, risk going over a couple minutes because I just want to ask this. Speaking of the maturation trend and price declines, as a result, we're seeing the oil majors around the world get more involved in power markets and invest in battery companies and EV companies, and obviously perhaps to the detriment of their products, right? The oil and gas that they sell. But the economic case has become so compelling that they're getting involved. Maybe, David, I'll give you the last word on that trend, maybe how it fits into our themes of the maturing industry. Round us out here.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I know the Atlantic Council is going to be looking at much more closely over the coming year, the role of the oil and gas industry in decarbonization, the role of the oil and gas industry in this energy transition, this transition to a more modern, flexible energy system. It's clearly a different it's a different sort of effort than we first saw in like oil and gas diversification 1.0, where I think you saw a lot of ultimately fruitless and failed forays into alternative energy, and you can argue what was the motivating factor behind that. This is a decade plus ago. But what you see now is, and frankly, Ørsted, formerly Danish Oil and Natural Gas before it changed its name, really at the tip of the spear on this is leaning into those diversification efforts or those new technologies that make the most sense with the existing business model and make the most sense with the existing expertise and engineering skill set. So offshore wind obviously has a lot of complementarities to offshore oil and gas development. And you see them leaning into that. You see other companies leaning into advanced biofuels because they understand how to produce liquid fuels. You're dealing with biorefineries, which have somewhat similar considerations as existing oil refineries. The question that I think is still unanswered and will maybe many more years before it is answered is ultimately what does this mean for the way what these companies are? Do they become utilities? Do they become digital services providers? Do they become oil and gas companies with an alternative energy sidecar? And that's going to have major implications as well for their cost of capital and for the sort of investors that they're going to have. Because the way that an investor treats a regulated utility is a heck of a lot different than the way that an investor treats an oil and gas major. And I think we'll all be in the front seats watching that unfold in the years to come.
Great, lots to still chew on here. Who knew such a wonky discussion could go on for a full hour and a half and we still have more to say. So thank you all for being here and listening to the conversation. Let's give a round of applause for our speakers.
Yeah, absolutely.